My name is Rich Keevey, and I'm the director of the Policy Research Institute for the region here at the Woodrow Wilson School. And we'd like to welcome you to today's forum, Vulnerable Populations in a Juvenile Justice System, a research and policy conference. We are pleased to co-sponsor this forum with the Future for Children project directed by Elizabeth Donahue, whom you will hear from at lunchtime, and with the Association for Children of New Jersey, ably represented by their Assistant Director, Mary Coogan, who you will also hear from later on this afternoon. With Mary and Elizabeth as co-directors for this forum, we were assured that this forum was going to be a great success. So thanks to Mary and to Elizabeth. Today's forum also supports the release of the recently published Future of Children volume on juvenile justice policy. In 1997, the MacArthur Foundation established a research network on adolescent development and juvenile justice to consider the ways in which scientific knowledge about adolescent development and juvenile crime could inform policy and practice within the juvenile and criminal justice systems. This current volume of Future for Children grew out of the MacArthur Network activities, and all of the journal contributor are associated in some way with today's endeavor. The conference will consist of 4 sessions, each devoted to a particular aspect of juvenile justice: youth in multiple systems, minority youth in the juvenile justice system, policy and practice in the New Jersey region, and a developmental approach to understanding adolescence and crime. So I'm sure you're quite aware, during the 1990s and the early 2000s, state laws were enacted that significantly tougher on juveniles than they had been in the past, mostly due to the upturn of juvenile violence in the 1980s. Although some of these punitive juvenile justice statutes have been softened in some states due to a downturn of juvenile crime in the last 10 years, an upswing in juvenile violence may swing the pendulum back again. Policy and practices need to be guided, we think, by substantive quantitative research and not by knee-jerk reactions to sensationalist newspaper headlines decrying the rise of juvenile violence. Recent research indicates that juveniles are different than adults in ways that should be taken into account when crafting effective juvenile justice policy. Today's speakers address policy questions such as the cognitive, emotional, and social differences between the adolescent and the adult that affect juveniles' competency to stand trial, and where those trials should actually be held. Adolescents' ability to change their behavior and how to predict which juveniles will reform and which will not. The increasing number of female offenders. The extent and causes and of disproportionate minority contact with the juvenile justice system, the effectiveness of interventions designed to prevent or treat delinquency, and the number of juvenile offenders dealing with drug or mental health issues. The experts participating in today's forum will offer their analysis and their recommendations for best practices in creating a juvenile justice system that works best for the special needs of adolescents. Our Policy Research Institute for the region here at the Woodrow Wilson School has recently explored a wide range of public policy issues, ranging from regional financial crises, to eminent domain issues, to fair housing, to school financing, to campus security, to economic development. And we are most pleased to explore with you today some of the complex facets involving the juvenile justice system. And now let me introduce to you our initial speaker. You have in your handout a detailed bio of all of our speakers and all of our panelists and all of our presenters. But let me just say a few words about Dr. Laurence Steinberg. Larry is the Distinguished University Professor of Psychology at Temple University. Dr. Steinberg is an internationally recognized expert on psychological development during adolescence, and he is also presently serving as the president of the Division of Developmental Psychology of the American Psychological Association. Dr. Steinberg is the author or co-author of more than 250 scholarly articles on growth and development during teen years. So please join with me in welcoming Dr. Steinberg. Larry, please.
Thank you all for coming today. I'm very much looking forward to a series of lively and informative presentations and discussion, and I want to thank Rich and Elizabeth Donahue and Mary Coogan for the terrific work they did in organizing today's program. Today's conference is a follow-on to the publication of the Future of Children issue on juvenile justice. And as Rich explained, that issue, to which several of today's speakers contributed, grew out of work conducted by the MacArthur Foundation Research Network on adolescent development and juvenile justice. But because only some of the contributors to the Future of Children issue are here today, I want to describe the publication as a whole and draw your attention to its contents. Before I do that, I think it's important to place the publication of that issue and today's conference in a bit of a historical context. American juvenile justice policy is in a period of transition. After a decade of declining juvenile crime rates, the moral panic that fed the Get Tough reforms of the 1990s and early 2000s, reforms that eroded the boundaries between juvenile and criminal court and exposed juveniles to increasingly harsh punishments, has waned. State legislatures across the country have reconsidered punitive statutes they enacted with enthusiasm just a few years ago. And what we may be seeing now is a pendulum that has reached its apex and is slowly beginning to swing back toward more moderate policies, as politicians and the public come to regret the high economic costs and ineffectiveness of the punitive reforms and the harshness of the sanctions. Several concrete indicators of this shift in juvenile justice policy and sentiment are noteworthy. First, in the wake of the Supreme Court's decision in Roper v. Simmons abolishing the juvenile death penalty, several state legislatures have repealed or are considering repealing statutes imposing sentences of life without parole on juvenile murderers. Other states have scaled back, often in response to mounting economic costs, automatic transfer laws that send youth to the adult criminal system by statutory exclusion. Many states have increased funding for community-based treatment programs as alternatives to institutional placement. And in a few states in where youth are under 18 are prosecuted in adult criminal court instead of juvenile court, promising efforts are underway to increase the age to 18, as it is in most states. And finally, several states have expanded procedural protection for juveniles in criminal court by enacting statutory provisions authorizing findings of incompetence to stand trial on the basis of developmental immaturity. So although many of the punitive reforms of the 1990s still remain in place, a policy shift seems to have occurred. Why did this happen? Well, several developments, I think, converged to change the direction of the nation's youth crime policy. Among the poorest, among the most important was a steady decline in juvenile crime beginning in 1994. And in the same way that the upward trend in juvenile violence during the 1980s set the stage for punitive legislation during the 1990s, the downward trend opened the door to discussions about returning to more moderate policies. Advocates for reform have also been successful in focusing media and political attention on a broad range of emerging social science evidence about adolescent development and juvenile justice. Editorials and op-eds in local and national newspapers have pointed to this evidence in arguing that adolescents lack the emotional and mental maturity of adults, that juvenile offenders should be given a second chance, and that the public supports rehabilitative efforts. Perhaps most important, that trying juveniles as adults is simply not cost effective. evidence of the high economic cost to the government of the wholesale incarceration of juveniles with adults, together with studies finding that adolescents released from adult correctional facilities are more likely to reoffend than those sentenced to juvenile facilities, have influenced the public debate. Now those, I assume many of you here today, those who applaud the trend toward justice policies that recognize the differences between adolescents and adults may be heartened by these developments. But we should not naively assume that this trend will proceed unabated. Juvenile crime rates, which have risen and fallen cyclically for decades, will likely rise again, though perhaps not to the extremes of the early 1990s. Although rates continue to be low, they have crept up recently, and in the past year or two, violent crime by juveniles has edged above where it stood in 2004, which was the lowest in nearly 2 decades. And given the economic crisis we face right now, we can only assume, given what we know about the relationship between economic problems and crime, that crime will start to rise. Now, it's still too early to tell whether recent reports of an uptick in juvenile crime indicate a reversal of a downward trend that we enjoyed for well over a decade, or instead a transient fluctuation. But stories about rising juvenile crime rates have begun to appear with increasing frequency in newspapers around the country, and publicity about juvenile crime very often triggers swings in policy. And so if the current upturn in juvenile offending is indeed the beginning of a worrisome trend, it will only take a couple of widely publicized juvenile crimes and a few outspoken pundits and politicians to push the pendulum back in the other direction. And this is how tenuous and reactive juvenile justice policymaking has been in recent years. The contributors to the Future of Children issue, as well as today's presenters, share a particular perspective. 3 elements of it are especially noteworthy. First, adolescents are different from adults in ways that ought to be taken into account in crafting sensible and effective policy. Second, policy and practice in the juvenile justice system should be guided by solid empirical evidence. And finally, to be effective, the juvenile justice system must be better integrated into the larger network of public institutions and agencies that deal with children, youth, and families. Most important, those that provide education, child protective services, and mental health treatment. The antisocial acts that bring young people into contact with the justice system are often accompanied by other problems, most of which the justice system is ill-equipped to address. And our failure as a nation to address these problems, whether because of poor coordination between systems, inadequate resources, or interagency turf wars, is one reason that so many youngsters enter, exit, and re-exit the justice system, through which many observers have correctly described as a revolving door. Let me turn then to an overview of the issue. In the first article of this volume, Elizabeth Scott and I offer a developmental perspective on juvenile justice that lays the groundwork for the articles to follow. Professor Scott will be speaking later today on this topic, so I will leave it to her to expand on this theme. I will, however, take this opportunity to make a shameless plug and draw your attention to our recently published book, Rethinking Juvenile Justice, in which we extend this argument in great detail. And we will be happy to sign any copies that you have here. The model of juvenile justice that we propose requires that the justice system both be able to make distinctions between offenders based on whether they represent a serious threat to public safety because of their risk for recidivism, and also to match juveniles effectively with appropriate sanctions and interventions. Because the juvenile justice system is charged not only with punishing the guilty and protecting the public, but also with rehabilitating young offenders, practitioners working within the system must make judgments about offenders' risk of future violence and their likely amenability to treatment. And the second article in the issue, by Ed Mulvey and Anne-Marie Iselin, examines what we know about the assessment of juveniles' risk for reoffending and their amenability to treatment. Now, one reason that practitioners came to favor the use of actuarial approaches to dispositional decision-making rather than using clinical judgment alone is the consensus that the use of subjective approaches has led to disparities in the treatment of minority and non-minority youth, which is the topic of the third contribution to this issue. And although the author of that article, Alex Piquero, is not here today, we will hear later this morning from Shauna Epps, who will be discussing what we know about minority youth in the justice system. And thank you for joining us here today. Now, racial disparities exist at virtually every stage in the juvenile justice system, but they are particularly striking with respect to the waiver of juveniles to adult court. And the fourth article in the Future of Children issue, by Jeff Fagan, examines recent efforts to redraw the boundary between juvenile and criminal justice systems, as well as findings of studies that compare juveniles who've been tried and sanctioned as adults with those who've committed comparable crimes but are retained in the juvenile justice system. Recent estimates indicate that around 25% of all juvenile offenders younger than 18 are prosecuted in adult court, mainly because they reside in states where the jurisdictional boundary is either 16 or 17. And Fagan shows in his chapter that transfer laws are not effective. Juvenile offending is not lower in states where it is relatively more common to try adolescents as adults, and juveniles who've been tried as adults are not less likely to reoffend than their counterparts who've been tried as juveniles. Indeed, as Fagan notes, the few empirical studies that have compared juveniles released from adult facilities which match samples of those coming out of juvenile institutions find that the former are more likely to reoffend than the latter. So it clearly is bad policy from a public safety point of view. The next article in the issue, by Beth Kaufman, explores the topic of female offenders, a portion of the juvenile offender population that has not been subjected to a great deal of systematic empirical study. And Beth will be speaking today about this other minority group, girls, during a panel later this morning. Now, I noted earlier that many youth entering the justice system have mental health problems, and the overlap between juvenile offending and mental illness is the subject of the fifth chapter in the Future of Children issue by Tom Grisso. And Tom will be discussing that topic during our first panel discussion this morning. In the Future of Children issue, Tom's chapter on mental health is followed by one on substance abuse by Lori Chasson. Now, as with other types of mental illness, the prevalence of substance abuse in the population of juvenile offenders is substantially higher than in the general population, according to some estimates, perhaps by a factor of 3 times. And in this chapter, Chasson asks whether the substance abuse treatment services delivered in the justice system are consistent with what is known about best practice. And her assessment is not exactly bleak, but it's far from laudatory. Although many adolescents receive substance abuse treatment within the juvenile justice system, either in residential facilities or in the community, the treatment that they receive does not routinely incorporate what experts have identified as best practice. And the justice system does not do a very good job of distinguishing between juveniles who do and do not need treatment. As is the case with mental illness, many substance-abusing offenders are not dangerous and would be better and more cost-effectively served by programs that divert them into community-based treatment, if such treatment were available and grounded in evidence-based practice. Finally, and most important, I think, in Chasson's article, is the recognition that because most offenders who enter the justice system do so for relatively short periods of time or move in and out of the system's custody, the lack of coordination between the juvenile justice system and other systems that provide substance abuse treatment in the community creates interruptions in the management of individuals' care. And the absence of aftercare for substance abusing offenders exiting the justice system is especially problematic. Now, the final article of the volume by Peter Greenwood takes a look at delinquency prevention and treatment programs. And the author there tells a good news, bad news story. The good news is that according to several comprehensive reviews of an array of delinquency prevention and treatment programs, there clearly are programs that both produce positive results and that are cost effective. But the bad news is that the use of these evidence-based practices is the exception rather than the rule. Greenwood estimates that only about 5% of youth who are eligible to enroll in an evidence-based treatment program receive treatment that has an empirically proven track record. One of the problems is that agencies rarely invest in developing data systems that permit them to monitor which programs are working and which are not. And as a result, most states' juvenile justice systems have no idea if they are spending their money wisely. And Greenwood notes that one impediment to effective juvenile justice policy is that policymakers are often unaware of research evidence on programs and policies that are not only effective, but that save taxpayers' dollars. Well, that, in a nutshell, is the territory covered in our Future of Children issue. And so let me make one concluding observation before turning to our first panel. It is painfully clear to me that the gap between what researchers know about the causes and treatment of juvenile crime and what policymakers and practitioners do in many locales is part of the problem. As Greenwood notes in his article, the authority of science is undermined on a daily basis by those who refuse to distinguish the difference between fact and opinion. And I hope that today's presentations, as well as the Future of Children issue, will help close that gap between science and practice. So again, thank you all for coming, and let's move to the next panel. Thank you.